Hey guys, it's Heather. I have to record myself talking and kind of presenting my PowerPoint to you on my computer at home through Screencast-O-Matic, which Dr. Newman helped me set up, because I can no longer be in class with you all since Carpe Diem Academy has started. So I did my chapter on Chapter 4, which was called Preparing to be a Culturally Responsive Practitioner, which overall just kind of means having an open mind, which is especially important in the teaching profession, but even more so important when you're going to be an ELL specialist, since all of your students will be coming from most likely very different cultural backgrounds. So this chapter was just kind of telling you why it's important to have an open mind and kind of some strategies, and it even talks about somewhat examples on when you don't realize you're not being culturally responsive, which I thought was really interesting because I personally think that I'm pretty culturally open, but I never really thought about some of the scenarios in this chapter and what I would do in some situations, so we could talk about that a little later. The quote that they mentioned at the beginning was, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes," by Marcel Proust. I think this quote is a really good opener for this chapter because it's not telling you to go into different scenarios, but rather to change your own viewpoint on things, and that's what they talk about a lot in this chapter. You kind of have to put yourself in other people's shoes or kind of change glasses with them and have a new outlook on the situation. So to be a culturally responsive teacher is to have a personal mindset. It's your own way of looking at the world, looking at situations, looking at people. It's not a set of engagement strategies. It's nothing about a strategy or certain ways to do things. It's your own personal mindset. And it involves a lot of self-reflection, and you have to know your own beliefs. So I know when I was reading this chapter, I kind of thought back to things that I personally believe in and my own experiences that I've had since I've already done my student teaching. You need to be mindful and present in this situation, especially in education. So many things are changing in the world, and so many new cultures are being welcomed into our school systems, and you need to be present in those moments. And you also need to be comfortable in your own cultural skin, which I thought was kind of silly to think about, but you really do have to personally know yourself, know what things you do accept, what kind of things you aren't very comfortable with just yet, and you need to know that about yourself. And it's okay to not be comfortable with everything, but by knowing that you don't like certain things, you're able to realize things you need to work on, things that could trigger you, and how to avoid them in certain situations, because a lot of those will come up in your school day, especially when working with ELL students. So one of the titles in the book, the subtitles, was Unpacking Our Implicit Bias. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So what that means... Oops. Sorry, I can't find my mouse here. They just really want you to understand that it's why you're acting that way, why you understand things in a certain way. So it's probably based on certain things that we've heard or seen before, and similar to the stereotypes we've seen before. And you don't really realize why you're feeling or thinking or acting that way. And then it brought up the lizard brain, like we talked about in Leah's PowerPoint, the lizard brain, as we know, is afraid to talk about sensitive issues for the possibility of an emotional or physical attack because of your, I don't know how to say it, amygdala. There we go. And you have to remember that it's solely based on emotions and feelings. So what the book talked about is kind of preparing your brain, getting yourself ready and having the intention to talk about emotional things that you're not very comfortable, sensitive issues, by preparing your brain and kind of lessening that threat to yourself and knowing that those topics are going to come up, it'll kind of decrease the possibility of having that emotional or physical attack and kind of make you less, I don't know the right word for it, less skeptic on certain topics, and it definitely will widen your horizons and kind of open your mind to things. One of the things that they suggested were finding mentors, real or virtual, and they meant virtual by kind of doing some research, of people with similar backgrounds. So you could even, when you're student teaching, a co-op, or when you're doing your clinicals, those are great people that have been through the same things, dealing with new cultures. Another strategy to try and work on unpacking your implicit bias was self-examination. And they talked a lot about making the familiar strange. So you would want to ask yourself, what is normal to you and why is it normal? So for example, when you eat, most likely you'll eat with a fork or a spoon or a knife. You'll use utensils. And you want to ask yourself, why is that normal for us to do? And kind of try and make that in your mindset strange to you. So think of it if you weren't to use utensils, and how that could be a strange thing for you to see someone using a fork and a knife and a spoon to eat their food. And that very well could happen when you have new students in your EL classroom. A lot of students, and I know for a fact Carly has her preschool students, and they don't know how to use a spoon. And that's something that you need to become desensitized to. You need to realize, okay, that might happen, and how can I deal with that not in a shocking way, and how can I work around accepting that while also incorporating the culture of the United States in with that child. Also, how do you expect a child to behave in the classroom? Okay, what do you think is normal in behavioral management in a classroom? Why do you expect those things? Why do you expect those children to behave in that way? And then you also need to respond positively and constructively to the students who are culturally different. There most likely will be a lot of behavioral issues in your classroom with students who are culturally different or ELs, and you need to realize, okay, none of this is necessarily negative, because it might be completely normal for them to act this way in their previous countries, and that's something that you need to realize. You can't negatively punish these students for something that they haven't necessarily learned yet. The next step in being culturally responsive is identifying your cultural frames of reference. So step 1 is accepting and understanding yourself as a cultural human being. While you might not think that you have much of a culture, since you most likely, all of us in this class, have lived in the United States our entire lives, you have to realize, okay, you have your own personal culture as well, and we're all very, very different. So you need to self-reflect on your surface, your shallow, and your deep culture. And I kind of related those to the iceberg concept that we've looked at before. I'm sure most of you have looked at it in the culture of linguistically and diverse learners, but if not, here it is, an example for you in picture. So on your surface, some questions that I picked out from the book were, how did your family identify ethnically or racially? So personally, I'm Irish, Italian, Czechoslovakian, German, and what else am I missing? And Scottish. So that in itself shows that I'm a cultural human being. Then when you go to the shallow level of culture, what earned you praise as a child? So I know anytime I was helping around the house, that would earn me a lot of praise, or just even listening to my parents when they gave me directions to do something. Then deep, what did your culture teach you about intelligence? And did you grow up believing it was set at birth? Now, this could differ in several ways, even though you and I grew up in the United States. Like I said before, our culture in this deep sense, in these specifically deep questions, are going to completely differ. And that's your own personal culture, and it's okay to have your own opinions on that completely, because that makes you who you are. And then what drives you, what shapes your worldview, and what influences your teaching? So this all completely changes amongst all of us as well. And these are all questions that we need to ask ourselves before we get into that type of teaching situation where we will have children of different cultures. You need to know yourself fairly well. You need to know all of these answers to these questions and why you feel that way and what made you in your past and in possible attitudes or stereotypes to make you feel this way. And it's completely okay to feel the way you are, just knowing why you feel that way is important. The next step is widening your interpretation aperture. And your aperture is a hole or an opening through which light travels, is what the book defined it as. So, step 1, like I mentioned before, put yourself in others' shoes. And that's something I personally try to do every day, whether I'm dealing with children in an ELL classroom or just my kindergartners in the morning. I constantly am putting myself in their shoes, thinking, okay, would they understand this? Do they get what I'm saying? Should I word it differently? And an example from the book, which is on page 58, but I'll read it to you, says, it's called the Silence Dialogue. The student was up and out of his seat, sharpening his pencil along with other students as the teacher was about to begin the lesson. She got his attention and said, "James, would you like to take your seat?" James said no and continued to sharpen his pencil. The teacher became outraged and sent James to the principal's office for being defiant. James was surprised and didn't understand why he was being sent to the office. When asked what happened, he said the teacher asked him a question and he answered her question. Now, if you were to put yourself in James's shoes, you could come to several different conclusions. Maybe, okay, he was being defiant and he just honestly didn't want to sit down yet. Or perhaps he was, or if you thought back to his at-home culture, you could also put into the perspective that you asked him a question, would you like to take your seat? And he wasn't yet done sharpening his pencil, so he said no, in a sense that he didn't mean to be rude, but that was his answer to the question. Now, if she would have been a little more culturally responsive, she could have gave him a directive and said, "James, please take your seat," in a way that he would have definitely understood what she wanted and would have most likely listened to the directions. Also, as a teacher in behavioral situations such as James's, you need to open your interpretations of why for students' actions, parents' responses, and our own instructional styles. So, why did James do that? Why did me saying that trigger this reaction that I had? Letting in more alternative explanations for students' learning behaviors and social interactions also benefits to understanding why something happened. So, like I explained with James's, there could be several different explanations to why that happened. And widening your viewpoint also lessens the risk of misinterpreting students' learning behaviors as intellectual deficits, just as Jane's. And then it also